It's kind of like our US anti-boycott laws, where if purchaser asks you to certify something is not of Israeli origin, you can't do that by law. But if they ask you for certificate of origin for the contents of something, it's a positive question, and an exporter can answer that. It's just kind of understanding the law in the foreign country and tailoring your question so that you're not making someone else break their law.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. This is Gwen Hassan. I'm thrilled to have a return guest today. Mollie Sitkowski has joined me again to kind of do a follow-up on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which I've heard some people refer to as loophole. So hi, Mollie, thanks so much for coming back again. I appreciate it.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So as I think most of our listeners know, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect a few weeks ago, June 21st. And everyone had been waiting for some kind of guidance to come out. And days before, we had finally received guidance from Customs and Border Protection and also from Department of Homeland Security. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain a bit, Mollie, about what you think are the key takeaways from the guidance, kind of what people can use from it, if there's any surprising kernels of wisdom in there that might be helpful to practitioners as they're trying to find their way through. Why don't we just dive in? I'll tell you, one of the first things that struck me was in the introduction section of this guidance, I saw specific mention of importers complying with the loophole and trying to beat the rebuttable presumption of goods having been produced with forced labor. And it said, in line with their internal risk assessments, they should undertake heightened due diligence. And I thought, first of all, that's very presumptive that most companies have done a forced labor risk assessment, which I don't think is the case yet. What do you think? Have most of your clients done this? And maybe so, because they're being advised by you, so they're ahead of the game. I don't know.
I wish I could say that was the case. Customs has been advocating forced labor risk assessments, at least for the past 4 years since they started issuing a lot of WROs since the 2016 TFTA, TIFTA.
Yep.
What it is. I don't know what people are calling that, but I think we should make up a good name for that too. Since that took out the loophole that if the goods weren't produced in the United States in sufficient quantities, you can import them even if they are produced with forced labor. Well, when the Congress took that out of Section 307 of 19 USC, then CBP really started going hard, the withhold release orders. And that's when they started releasing on their website, you should conduct a risk assessment. You should look at your imports. You should look at the Department of Labor guidelines. You should look at the International Labor Organization guidelines. And they started saying all of that. And then last year was the first year the CTPAT annual questionnaire included forced labor questions, which also kind of told people they should be doing risk assessments, but no one really was yet. And so the only real risk assessments that I saw prior to this year really were in very high risk industries. So specifically textiles. Not just the cotton WRO, but just because there is so many allegations of forced labor within textile supply chains that the larger textile importers were already doing risk assessments, whether it was for Chinese forced labor, Bangladeshi forced labor, Malaysian forced labor, these were things that were already on their radar. So I'd say, don't worry if you weren't doing them. Almost no one was, but you should definitely
start doing it now.
Yeah. Start at least mapping your supply chains and figuring out where the higher risk supply chains reside.
So I had a conversation with a client last week who said, how can I do a risk assessment when I don't have a map of my supply chain? And I mean, it raises a good question. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Can you really assess your risk if you don't know what your supply chain looks like. And conversely, if you don't have an idea of what the risk profile is for human trafficking and forced labor, is any kind of supply chain mapping going to be accurate? I think maybe they need to happen almost in parallel or simultaneously. What do you think?
So the way some of my clients are doing it is we're looking at the products that they import and whether they fall into the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force guidance, the FLETF. They issued guidance after CBP's guidance for importers. They issued it the Friday before the Tuesday that the UFLPA became effective. And they are focusing on tomatoes, which they have been, cotton, textiles, which seems kind of duplicative, but that's okay.
Yep.
And then silica-based. And they included polysilicon in there, which can be found in a lot of electronics. So a lot of my clients are starting with reviewing their products, understanding with the product managers whether their products contain anything that was in the FLTF guidance.
Okay.
And then if it is, then they start the supply chain mapping for those. So it's a risk assessment based on the FLETF guidance rather than on any known criteria like by the Department of Labor or the International Labor Organization.
So they're kind of narrowing the scope a bit to start and focusing on the highest, or at least what we currently believe are the highest risk identified areas and going from there.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Something else that I noticed, and this is in section 1, they talk about, and I guess this is maybe just naivete on my part, but it just struck me that the solution here for someone who ends up with a withhold release order or a seizure of some kind is that they have to prove a negative, because the language says must be able to substantiate the absence of inputs subject to UFLPA from its supply chain. How do you prove a negative?
And with clear and convincing evidence.
Yeah, clear and convincing. That's a high standard.
It's a very high standard. So the withhold release orders are going to still be under the withhold release order. They have 90 days. You have a smaller burden of proof for that. That's going to apply everywhere except for items that are subject to the UFLPA. Like the cotton withhold release order, the cotton WRO has been converted into the UFLPA process as of June 21st. But let's say you're importing gloves from Malaysia that have a WRO on them. You still have the WRO process and procedures that you can follow. If your good is detained under the UFLPA, then you have 30 days to provide this clear and convincing evidence, which is almost impossible. And I think
a short time frame, 30 days. Yeah.
Because the WROs, you have 90 days.
Yep.
And even then, that was not enough time unless you had done a lot of things as part of a risk assessment. Yeah. So this time your customs is going to require, if it's the raw material they're concerned about, you have to prove all the way back to the raw material. So if it's cotton, to the field. You have to provide transportation records, purchase orders, payment records. Basically, you want to prove that along every step of the way, the person that you say that you're getting your cotton from is in fact the person that you did get it from, supported with payment records, supported with their invoices, supported with transportation records. The burden for proving that you don't have Uyghur laborers working in your facility is a lot less high, but you still need to give time card records, wage and payment records, huku registration cards. And then you need to prove that the quantity that you gave. So if you say, okay, here's 49 of everything you asked for, we have 49 employees. Customs is then going to examine your output to make sure that you only have 49 employees. Mm-hmm. Because if you have 49 employees that you've provided all this information for, and then you have the output of a 100-person factory, customs is going to be like, give us the other 51.
One of the things that was interesting too is the extension of the UFLPA beyond just the list, because there's the list that's been published of companies that have connections to that region and to historic practices of forced labor, but it extends beyond that, right? And it's now any connection to someone who may be Muslim or a Uyghur or of Muslim or Uyghur connection, even if they're outside of that Xinjiang province. How do you go about that and figure that out?
And you're referring to the FLTF guidance has a list of companies. Some of them, so Hoshine is on there. They already had a WRO against them, so that wasn't surprising. The other have been identified by Customs as being involved with forced labor. So then Customs says, not only do you have the list of companies, you have the list of products, which we just talked about. You have imports from affiliates of these companies. And then the fourth one is anyone outside Xinjiang who's using Uyghur forced labor. And that's where you have to, for your manufacturers, asking them. So you have to ask on the first level. So your manufacturer. The manufacturers are they're a little wary of this question right now because there are laws in China that prohibit them from participating in a foreign boycott. So you have to be really finesse the question. But basically, we're asking for a positive affirmation. So tell us a list of all of your employees and their hukou registration provinces, rather than say, do you have any Uyghur laborers? No. Say, tell us your list of and their hukou registrations. They're not providing you the cards, so there's hopefully no privacy issues with that.
Right.
You're not focusing on Xinjiang. You're not focusing on Uyghurs. So hopefully their talons are a little bit down in complying with that. But you start with your manufacturer, but then also technically, you need to make sure there's no manufacturers that supply to your manufacturer that does that. That's where it gets really hard. But also, the harder it is for you to identify that, the harder it is for Customs to identify it. But Customs may identify it in a different supply chain and then know that your supply chain is similar and may detain a shipment just because.
I did know and was happy to see that they said, if you have other shipments of goods that you can show have the identical supply chain, you can get almost the opposite presumption, right? Which is, if we've proven that this group is good, then the following 20 things should also be good because the supply chain's the same.
Yeah.
So that gave me a little hope that a manufacturer could put in a lot of work into establishing a supply chain, but then use it multiple times for multiple products if it translates, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you're really not going to be able to get all that information in the 30 days. But you may want to then file a protest when that one shipment is seized and subject to forfeiture proceedings. You may want to file a protest or an administrative request so that you can provide all that evidence for future supply chains.
To establish, kind of put a line in the sand almost.
Right.
All right, we're going to invest now, and then hopefully that'll clear the way for future shipments. Something else I noticed that I hadn't expected in the guidance is it talks about how if an exception is made, and you're able to successfully argue, hey, our goods aren't subject to this because there is no connection to this province and there is no Uyghur labor, that they are required to and will publish the information that you supply publicly. And it'll be part of a congressional report, which raises an interesting question then about proprietary supply chain information. Because if you're in a competitive market where you think some of your suppliers and the connections you have with them are an advantage for you, you're going to be required, if you defend that holding, to publicly release your supply chain and your map. Have you had any clients concerned about that yet?
Not yet. I mean, there is an exception for business confidential information, the FOIA exception.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that they will treat that as confidential for purposes of the supply chain, because the report is more about your company, maybe the manufacturer, and that exact exclusion granted. Mm-hmm. So hopefully they will not have to provide the backup to Congress, which would be FOIA-able.
Okay. Well, let's hope. Obviously, we haven't seen any enforcement yet under it, but I was worried. Knock on wood. I was worried some of the reporting would have some of that supply chain information in it, but good to know that we think we can probably protect that under FOIA.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The next thing I noticed, which they go into great detail, which I appreciated, in section 2 about how to request an exemption from the rebuttable presumption. And it lists out kind of the different categories of things that you can supply. And we already talked about by clear and convincing evidence and what a high standard that is. But then they provide this resources for supply chain diligence section. Wow, it is a lot. There's 2 pages of links to resources and information. Is the implication there that anything that's in this list is kind of free game for CBP to come after you for?
This has been the list. They've had this on their website for a while, at least the U.S. government resources. So they've had this kind of in their scope for at least 4 or 5 years. The one thing I will say, like one of them, the comply chain, the Department of Labor's comply chain,
Yeah.
for a while there, it wasn't working.
Oh.
So now it's back to working, which is nice because customs would point you to it and then you'd look at it and you'd be like, oh, this doesn't even work. So it's working again, which is great. But this is the list. This hasn't really changed over the past few years. But I think it's really fascinating that Customs said they're not even going to really consider your clear and convincing evidence unless you have internal policies and procedures against forced labor first.
Yeah.
That's like their threshold question, which is easy to do. And everyone should be doing that now.
And including a supplier code of conduct, which
Right.
they specifically mention. Yeah.
Right.
And if you don't have one, that's kind of the table stakes at this point, which is
Exactly.
you've got to specifically prohibit it before they'll even talk to you about anything else.
And a best practice in there would be flowing down the requirements from your first tier suppliers to their suppliers,
Yeah.
because this is a whole of supply chain, just like conflict minerals.
Yeah.
It's a whole of supply chain compliance, and the manufacturers need to be on board and they need to hold their manufacturers responsible too.
Well, they also mentioned specifically, now we're in section 4, the training on forced labor risks, not only for employees, but also for agents who select and interact with suppliers. So I've seen, obviously, the recommendation before that anyone who's involved in your internal purchasing organization needs this kind of training. And that's been something I think's been fairly standard for a few years. But the idea that you should now be training outside third parties about forced labor risk, if they have any connection to your supply chain, I thought was an interesting extension.
I don't know if we talked about this last year, but one of the clients that I work with, they have like a supplier week. And they do compliance training, as it's like, here's how we're marketing your products. Here's, how we can develop together or whatever. But then there's like a whole day on compliance, FCPA compliance, forced labor compliance, good manufacturing practices. It is like very in depth. And that is an A+ from me on doing that. In addition to the agents, Customs was throwing out, they were issuing RASAs. So at this point in time, I have so many acronyms in my head and executive orders, but basically like quick response audits almost. But they were issuing them to some importers of chemicals this past winter, focusing on Xinjiang. And one of the clients with whom we were working had an agent that did go and select manufacturers for them and did do like an audit for good manufacturing practices to make sure the quality was good, but did not include in their audit forced labor. And they weren't trained on like indicators of forced labor and everything. And that was a real gap in that, yes, they have someone specifically going to these facilities in China that works for them, and they haven't been trained on forced labor indicators. And that's not one of the things that they fill out when they're auditing a company. So that was like somewhere where, oh my God, it's so easy to do. You already have someone walking in these factories. Why not just include this additional element?
Yep. I love that idea of a supplier week where they're focused on all different parts of the supplier relationship. I think that's a great practice. I noticed too that they talk about monitoring the supply chain compliance with your supplier code of conduct. So I had a conversation with a client about this last week as well, which is their question to me, and I really didn't know how to answer, was, well, we can't get anybody into the whole western half of China anyway. And our own people who are located there are telling us that because, which you referenced, the kind of anti-boycott language requirements for China, they can't participate in this process or feel like they're at risk if they do. So how do you monitor the compliance of your supply chain with your code of conduct if you can't get people in to meet and to visit and to, do you do certifications? Do you hire somebody else? I don't know if for a while UL was doing these kinds of inspections, but I don't know if they still are.
Yeah, so a lot of the independent inspection agencies have been kicked out of China because of this. And some companies, like when you have Chinese employees on the sanctions side.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I deal with is also sanctions. And part of the anti-boycott law was that you couldn't comply with U.S. sanctions on countries that China wasn't also sanctioning. And they had someone quit over it because the Communist Party had like a training session telling people about the new law when it was released last year. And they were like, their employee, their compliance person was like, I'm going to go work for a Chinese company because I don't want to have to deal with like being between a rock and a hard place. So the fact of the matter is that it is a rock and a hard place. So what we've been doing is more of a paper tiger where our clients will send out questionnaires, be very broad, ask about written policies and procedures, ask for them to upload it, ask them where their suppliers are, ask if they have requirements that flow down to their suppliers, less about auditing the company specifically and more about whether they understand these requirements and whether they're flowing them down.
That's a good approach. It's not ideal, but paper is better than nothing.
Right. Yeah.
And I noticed too that there's this big focus on internal controls. And do you have those controls? And do you have those procedures in place? And it also mentions specifically credible audits to identify forced labor indicators.
Yeah.
Which, again, presumes that such an audit is even possible at this point. But it's, again, having them self-certify and asking, like you said, broad questions and having them upload information. I don't know. Nobody knows yet whether that'll meet the requirement of a credible audit or whether it'll be enough, but it's better than not doing anything.
And if you have like this one company that had a sales agent or purchasing agent going in and touring the factory anyway, if that agent can surreptitiously maybe fill out a checklist about indicators of forced labor, like, yes, I saw the housing and it all looked like it wasn't falling down and going to set on fire at any moment, like having them fill out a little checklist, not that they're asking questions to people necessarily, but maybe doing it on the down low. If they're a Chinese citizen, they might still have a problem with it because of the anti-boycott law. But if you couch it in terms of International Labor Organization standards, or Australia has a modern slavery act like UK, and if you couch it in more general international standards than US standards, maybe someone will be more willing to participate in that process.
That's a great tip. Yeah, I'm trying to couch it in terms of maybe the ILO's guidance. The UN's guidance,
right?
Those aren't country specific. Yeah. And in most cases, one would argue, if you're looking for the ILO indicators of forced labor, you're also looking for the same things that customs will be looking for.
Right.
All right, listeners, if you take nothing else away from this podcast, it's Mollie's suggestion, which is a great one, that you use the kind of international indicators. And actually, they're listed within the guidance. There's a whole section of international guidance to couch your self-assessments and kind of your self-audit programs. And if you're lucky enough to have someone on the ground, questions that you can ask Chinese nationals to use without maybe putting them in that tight spot of defying their own country's anti-boycott laws.
It's kind of like our US anti-boycott laws, where if purchaser asks you to certify something is not of Israeli origin, you can't do that by law. But if they ask you for certificate of origin for the contents of something, it's a positive question and an exporter can answer that. It's just kind of understanding the law in the foreign country and tailoring your question so that you're not making someone else break their law.
It is an art as much as a science. Yes. The other thing I wanted to note for everyone is they do say multiple times in the guidance that it will be easier and faster for them to review your cases if all of your documentation is in English.
Yeah.
So again, another reason to not wait until you've got case and you've got 30 days to respond and you have to try and find someone to translate Chinese production documents. Going and doing that risk assessment now and developing that map of your supply chain and coming up with the production record and the logistics record and the import. So you have time to translate those materials.
Well, the thing is, unless it's for the import at issue, technically customs doesn't have to accept it. So even if you do it beforehand, that's good. That's great. You can provide it to customs, but customs may come back and say, cool, we want it for this exact batch.
This specific box. Yeah.
But at least your manufacturers will understand what they need to do for that. Also, we've been putting contractual terms into purchase contracts that say, you agree to provide us with all the documentation that we request to prove that you're in compliance with forced labor standards. And if you don't, you indemnify us for the costs of detention, seizure, whatever. That's another way where, yes, so you get a shipment detained from customs. You can't get all your ducks in a row in 30 days. They seize the shipment. You can then go back to the manufacturer, hopefully under your contract, to ask for the cost back and then tell them, hey, we can't purchase from you until we get all these documents because we're going to need to prove to customs the next time we import from you that there's no forced labor.
So they have a real vested interest in, skin in the game in terms of giving you the documents that you would need to defend against and to rebut the presumption, as it were. Yes.
Exactly.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Any last thoughts before we leave about what people should take away from this guidance? On the whole, did you think it was helpful? Positive?
It was better than nothing. I'd say take away supplier code of conduct, must do. Try and understand where your Chinese manufacturers are coming from, where their employees are coming from, and couch your language more generally than focused. And you only have 30 days. So when one shipment gets detained, know that every shipment from that manufacturer will be going forward. So you might want to rely on that new exclusion process.
And have a backup plan for your supply chain. Too. Yeah.
Safety stock.
Yep. And not sole sourcing somewhere where you can't find another supplier if you have to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Mollie. I appreciate your time and your wisdom as always. And good luck. We'll see where this goes. I'm kind of on the edge of my seat waiting for the first enforcement action, as horrible as that sounds.
I know, but you have a fun name for it now. So
Loophole for everyone. Yeah. Thank you very much.